Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 3 of our 5 Fridays in October for our 6th annual October symposia, which is we're doing in a series of webinars due to our pandemic situation. The theme for today is after our first session where we spoke about impact in the face of occupational disease. And then we talked in the second session about knowledge mobilization for the prevention of OC disease. Today is about change for occupational disease prevention. We do invite you to go back and review if you missed with your joint health and safety committees or any audience you wish, share the last 2 sessions, and please join us for the next 2 coming up in the next couple of Fridays. Around action and also leading up to Lung Month in November. I would like to encourage as well everyone to complete evaluations, whether you join us live or if you've seen it in the recording. We are welcoming evaluations. Our first speaker is going to talk to us, Sarah Vandenhoven, about an update on the Government of Canada's Chemical Management Plan. The federal government is exploring opportunities to renew its approach to chemicals management, and Health Canada is exploring ways to enhance the protection of workers from exposure to chemicals by leveraging the information tools and/or technical expertise of the Chemical Management Plan. This presentation will provide an overview of recent work to explore opportunities in this area, with a focus on potential considerations for identifying chemicals of concern in the workplace, which was the topic of a recent CMP Science Committee meeting. Sarah Vandenhoven is a Senior Science Advisor in the existing Substances Risk Assessment Bureau at Health Canada. She's been with the Chemicals Management Plan since its inception in 2006 in various roles supporting chemicals risk assessment at both the Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health Canada. Currently, she contributes to the development of various policy areas at Health Canada, including occupational exposure. Please welcome Sarah Vandenhoven.
I just wanted to thank everybody for joining the webinar today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be presenting on prioritization approaches for occupational exposure under Canada's Chemicals Management Plan. And maybe I'll just also mention that I'm also joined today by Angelika Zidic, a Senior Manager at the existing Substances Risk Assessment Bureau at Health Canada with me. I'll just start off by giving a bit of a background on the Chemicals Management Plan, or the CMP, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, and then focus on considerations for identifying potential risks from exposure to chemicals in the workplace, or in other words, looking at what potential data sources or other factors we could be considering that would help inform the identification of priorities. In an ever-changing climate, the types and magnitudes of exposure to chemicals are changing. It's complicating our ability to assess health risks. Under the CMP, Health Canada assesses the risks of chemical exposures to the general population. However, these changing chemical uses and market shifts would also have an impact on assessment implications for the workplace. We know that there will continue to be a reliance on chemicals to manufacture goods as chemical inventories continue to grow. And we also recognize there's a need to have an agile or nimble process in place to identify or prioritize chemicals of concern as these market shifts and chemical use patterns change. So that our assessment work plan is essentially always evolving and staying relevant. As Kimberly was saying, the Chemicals Management Plan is up for renewal. That's targeted for March of this year, of next year. So for the past couple of years, Health Canada has been exploring areas where we could improve or do more and remain responsive to this ever-changing climate. And occupational exposure is one of these areas that are being explored. In our risk assessments under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA, we haven't been looking at occupational exposures, and stakeholders have often identified this as a gap in that the CEPA assessments focus on risks to the environment at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and at Health Canada, we're looking at exposures to general population. And this is different than the approach taken by most other international agencies like ourselves. Our international counterparts consider the risks to both the general population and workers in their risk assessments. And we work quite closely with the US EPA, for example, and through the US-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council Chemicals Management Project. The fact that Health Canada wasn't considering occupational exposures it was identified as an area of misalignment. And what we see actually with the international government assessments is that it's the occupational exposure that's often the driver for risk management. And so really that's that worker scenario that's presenting the risk. So I work in a group that conducts the risk assessments under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA, this larger circle in the diagram you see here. But we work closely with other colleagues that administer other acts related to chemicals management that you see here. And other than the pesticides program, under the CMP, we haven't considered occupational exposure. So as we started to explore opportunities to do more in this area as part of the renewal of the CMP, we realized quite quickly that we needed to be working with our colleagues in the WHMIS program, so those who are administering the Hazardous Products Act, as well as the federal, provincial, and territorial occupational health and safety regulators. So for a couple of years now, we've been engaging these groups to see where the opportunities are that could be most helpful to those OSH regulators and also ultimately provide the most impact on helping to protect workers from the risks of chemical exposures. So in 2018, we started a working group with a few representatives from the provinces to help to start scoping this work and identify opportunities where information we may have at Health Canada or our expertise could be leveraged to enhance the protection of workers. So since we started in 2018, we've surveyed the OSH regulators in Canada to get a lay of the land and understand who's doing risk assessment, how occupational exposure limits are set in the provinces, any chemical issues they're seeing, and just to help gauge if there was interest in working together and where the opportunities may lie. So from there, we heard that there was interest in more collaboration, and there could be more opportunities for Health Canada to help advance a more proactive or preventive approach in the provinces. So we kept working with the provinces, and we met with each of the jurisdictions in February of 2019 to identify some key areas where Health Canada could provide help. And this discussion helped to inform the development of a consultation document that was published online in the summer of 2019. Then this summer, we just posted a document online summarizing what we heard from that consultation. And then another recent activity of the working group was to develop a discussion paper that we brought to our CMP Science Committee in February that was focused on prioritization. And I'll speak more to that in the next few slides. When we talk about prioritization or I'm talking about identifying priorities for further work, these are some of the potential outcomes that we'd identified in the consultation document. So we might have information that would flag a substance as a priority for risk assessment, for example, or occupational exposure limit development as a priority for research and monitoring, or a hazard classification, or even a need for increased awareness or compliance and enforcement needs under the Hazardous Products Act. So in February, we asked our CMP Science Committee for their input on key feeders and sources of information that we could consider to inform future work in the area of occupational exposure. And we also wanted them to consider any international lessons learned. So the CMP Science Committee is an external committee we've established under the CMP to provide us with scientific advice on a variety of topics that we'll bring to them. So in addition to the core members of the committee, we have the opportunity then to invite a few ad hoc members to provide a specific expertise relating to the topic of that specific meeting. So for the February meeting, we invited Dr. Paul Demers from the Occupational Cancer Research Center, Colin Murray from WorkSafe BC, and Dr. Cheryl Peters from CareX. So we organized 2 webinars for them to help inform any recommendations they would have on international lessons learned. We heard from the European Chemicals Agency, the US EPA, and Australia's Chemical Assessment Program. And all of these programs consider exposures to both the general population and workers in their risk assessment programs. So then the committee met in Ottawa for 2 days to discuss specific charge questions that we put forward to them. And they're just finishing up their report now, and we're hoping we would have something that we could post online in early 2021. So today's presentation is very much along the same lines as what we presented to the CMP Science Committee, and I welcome your thoughts too at the end to see, if there's anything you think we missed, or if you have suggestions on or ideas that would help us with identifying priorities for further work in the workplace. So we already have a process under the CMP for identifying priorities for risk assessment. At Health Canada, we use these different feeders or mechanisms that you see along the top to see if there are flags that would highlight substances that might warrant, a need for further risk assessment based on concerns to the general population. That's been our focus. So we use this approach with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they look for concerns to the environment. So we look at the various data sources for any hazard flags or flags for potential exposure to the general population. So for example, just looking at the mechanisms along the top, we might look for information, or what we would look at information we've received from industry, any emerging science or monitoring data that might indicate potential for exposure, and results from international risk assessments. So if we wanted to leverage this process or expand on it to also identify potential concerns in the workplace, we would probably need to see some new feeders added or some new information sources anyways to be added to this process for that worker lens. And the rest of the presentation is really just to suggest some ideas that we're considering and what we presented this to the CMP Science Committee. So there are a variety of different types of information or specific data sources that could be considered if we're looking to identify chemicals of concern in the workplace. And I'll go through each of these a bit more in the following slides. But we could think of it in terms of hazard classification, looking what's on the US EPA's CompTox chemical dashboard, looking to see what sources of workplace exposure monitoring data are out there, both in the US or Canada, looking at ways to have, or if there are ways to get data on workplace incident reports. I'll get into a slide with some examples from WorkSafe BC, for example. Occupational disease surveillance could be a source of information, both, again, American or Canadian data sources, and mandatory industry reporting. So we have mechanisms under SEPA to do that, and also the US program does as well. So if we think about hazard classification first, there are a number of organizations that develop GHS hazard classifications that could be leveraged as new science becomes available and classifications are developed or changed. This could be considered as a trigger to look more closely at a substance and consider if there would be a change in risk that we would want to look at more closely, for example. Workplace exposure monitoring is another potential source of information for prioritizing worker health. However, the availability of data could be challenging. On workplace exposure monitoring, all jurisdictions in Canada, essentially the workplace exposure monitoring is an employer responsibility, and that data, those monitoring results may or may not be available to the occupational health and safety regulators. There are, however, some sources of information that could be available. One example is the Canadian Workplace Exposure Database, which has centralized nearly 500,000 air sampling measurements for approximately 330 substances across 6 jurisdictions. And that data comes from the 70s up to about 2010. So that could be considered a source of information. The US, OSHA's program also has a chemical exposure health database that includes data on personal area and bulk samples for various airborne contaminants that have been taken by their compliance officers. So we could look to that as an indicator as well, just in the US. A third source of data could be workplace incident reports. Incident reporting, is a component of chemicals management programs at Health Canada in areas of pesticides, drugs, and other consumer products. In the workplace, reporting systems for workers or employers to notify OSH regulators of workplace incidents isn't very common in Canada. Workers' compensation boards would typically receive notice of a workplace injury or illness that could be claimed. But WorkSafe BC does have an employer's incident reporting system that could be valuable in terms of signaling where to prioritize efforts. However, we need to give a bit of thought to, whether that would be representative of issues across Canada or not. Another potential source of incident reporting information is the Canadian Poison Control Centres. So the information from these centers is currently being centralized, and based on some queries that we asked for last year, they were able to pull out some numbers to see or to show where incidents have happened in the workplace and some basic information on the types of chemical exposures. So you can see in the tables here that a small percentage of the calls received in Quebec in the Maritimes were from a workplace incident. And the US also has a large centralized poison control system that brings together the data from different states. The fourth potential data source includes occupational disease surveillance. So here we have the occupational disease surveillance system, which could be leveraged to identify and monitor trends in work-related disease in Ontario. This system was created in 2016, linking existing provincial health databases and job information in order to study occupational disease and inform prevention activities. So that could be a potential source of information to leverage. And then population health surveys could be another source. So in the CMP, we often use biomonitoring data from population health surveys like the Canadian Health Measures Survey, or CHMS, or the Maternal Infant Research on Environmental Chemicals Project. But there could be opportunities to look at these in different ways and mine for chemical exposures, disease status, and occupation. Or look to other sources like the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow Project, for example. So the fifth source that we have in the presentation is mandatory industry reporting data. So in Canada, under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, there are a few sections that allow the Government of Canada to collect information from industry on chemicals in commerce. So we use this quite regularly to inform our assessments and to inform our prioritization efforts. We would typically ask for information on quantities and uses of specific chemicals, or their concentrations or release data or facility information, and to some extent ask for hazard data as well. But in the US, they have a similar information gathering provision. It's called their Chemical Data Reporting Rule. And so they'll ask similar types of questions, but since they also assess exposure to workers in their risk assessments, they have a few extra questions that they tend to ask that we have not. So some examples of that would be like quantities that are used on a site, or number of workers at a site, or number of workers that are expected or likely to be exposed to a chemical. So apart from bringing together all these different data sources to help identify priority chemicals from an occupational exposure perspective, there's also different approaches that could be applied. So we could think about looking at chemicals that have already been identified as toxic, for example, and where risk management actions have already been taken. So an example would be looking at CMP assessments that have already identified a concern to the general population, and taking another look to see if concerns in the workplace are likely, or assessing if the existing risk management measures that were put in place to protect the general population are also sufficient to be protective in an occupational setting, or looking at risk management actions that have been taken internationally to address workplace risks. Another approach, just moving down to the right and down in this circle diagram, would be focusing on certain sectors, maybe where there's a large volume of workers, or workers that for some reason may be more vulnerable. Another example would be high production volume chemicals. This has historically been used as a way to prioritize chemicals management efforts. However, I think we need to give more thought to if this is also relevant or a relevant trigger or indicator for potential risk to workers. And then lastly, continuing to move up in this circle, another approach could be looking at emerging sectors or emerging uses of chemicals. Some examples here would be like e-waste recycling, or more recently, increased use of hand sanitizer, for example. We could think about integrating these various data sources and then these different approaches into a framework that would help us inform chemical priorities for worker health. I think this signals that there are still a few needs. There's a need to coordinate efforts for generating and sharing information to help with this priority setting and establishing partnerships. It also really signals a need to centralize information in one place and ideally have similar reporting formats. This is a need that's not unique to worker health. The challenges with centralizing information for chemical prioritization, whether for general population or workers, is an issue that many governments struggle with. And then lastly, when we think about integrating data sources and approaches for prioritizing worker health, there's a number of key factors for consideration that have surfaced as we've started to think about this. I think it'll be important to think about the needs of the federal, provincial, and territorial occupational health and safety regulators, both the hazard and the exposure of a chemical, if there are certain workers that are more vulnerable than others, and also considering what's modifiable and actionable and where gaps exist that need to be addressed. So in terms of next steps, we plan to continue to work with the FPT occupational health and safety regulators to identify, and further scope out and refine how a modernized CMP could help them. We also plan to continue to engage with stakeholders and look forward to any questions or comments you have today. And ultimately, all of this is meant to inform our path forward. What we learn from the FPTs and the stakeholders will be used to inform the development of a modernized CMP. And we're certainly here to learn and welcome any comments and questions. I think there's probably time on the agenda to open it up for questions if there are any. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
The first one, are you finding the provincial responsibility for OHS from regulatory standpoint a barrier to your work, or has it made it more rich in your experience thus far?
It's a good question. I haven't seen it as a barrier. No, I think we've had great discussions with the FPTs, and I think they see value in being provided with any additional information that would help them be more proactive or preventive, be it identification of risks through a risk assessment or any of the areas that we've been exploring. So I think I don't want to speak for them, but I kind of think they're seeing it as another source of information to help them in their work.
Great. And what is the Canadian Workplace Exposure Database?
Oh, I think that was actually presented at last year's October event. I believe, I know the lead anyways is Hugh Davies out of BC. And I think his team has been collecting exposure monitoring data from the provinces. I think the data is older now because I think less and less data is residing with like the ministries of labor. So I believe the most recent data is from around 2010. But yeah, so it's this database where they've been consolidating what I think the provinces had available to them. And I see a link to it was posted in the chat. Thank you for that.
Another question is, could there be national direction on the requirement for a centralized database for exposure data?
That's an interesting idea. I think just like the challenges that they're having with the Canadian Workplace Exposure Database is that a lot of it isn't. The regulators don't have it anymore. So I think there are challenges with getting the data to put in a centralized database. But I think it's certainly useful. From what we've been seeing in the US EPA assessments, like they're leveraging what's publicly available in the OSHA database of monitoring, exposure monitoring data.
Thanks. I believe this next question may have been somewhat answered in the chat already, but Kumail asks, most of the data seems lagging of what has already happened. Is there a database to identify proactive data of leading indicators?
I'm not aware of any other databases. If people have any sources of information to suggest, I would love to hear them. What I just presented is sort of our understanding of the landscape that is out there right now. But certainly open to hearing if others have ideas or knowledge of other sources of information.
Sarah, sorry, Jennifer, I just wanted to go back to one as you're perusing the next, but you talked about the CWED database, and thanks, John. I threw up a less clear link to that, but do you think there could be national direction on the requirement for centralized exposure data? And I guess that was sort of a larger expansion of the question on whether, the fact that things are regulated provincially, if it's a barrier. So if there could be national direction on the requirement for people to provide more centralized exposure data, that might help. I just wonder if that's in the path or the plan anywhere.
I would have to go back and talk to others to see what they think about that. It hasn't. We haven't really been talking about having a national requirement or anything like that, or something like that is feasible or not. But that's an idea I'll bring back to the group, though.
Dorothy asks, where are the workers' voices in this discussion? Are they coming from unions or worker centers?
We've been leveraging as much as we can an existing stakeholder committee that exists for the WMIS program. So we've been getting in on their multi-stakeholder groups and their meetings. And so there are labor unions represented there. So I think that's probably the most organized way we've been doing it, reaching out to the worker or union groups. But if you have other suggestions on ways to reach out, I'd welcome that. Our consultation document was certainly open to the public for everybody to provide comments on. But those are the two examples I can think of.
And she also asks, how does the government's interest in informed substitutions connect with the worker health agenda?
I think we'll have to see where that goes, because informed substitution is certainly another one of the areas that are being explored under CMP renewal. And I would think that that would be sort of a general approach that if we were moving forward in the area of occupational exposure, that any activities that were taking place on informed substitution would apply both to general population and the occupational exposure scenarios. So you're right. That's another priority area that we've been looking at.
And Glenn asks, how do workers' compensation agencies use the data developed to assist in claims adjudication?
Can you repeat? Oh, I think I see the question. And I don't think I have an answer to that. How do workers' compensation aid? I would have to go back and ask a contact from one of those groups, or I don't know if anybody on the line is from a workers' compensation agency. but I don't have an answer to that one, sorry.
Okay. And the last question I see is all of the funding for this project from the federal government?
Yeah, as opposed to, yeah. So we're looking, to renew the CMP would be federally funded.
So that's the last of the questions I see in the chat. I'm not sure if anything has been received online.
Yeah, and Sarah, while we're waiting on that, I think Bonnie has a Facebook. You talked about the Canadian Partners for Tomorrow project. Can you expand a little bit on CanPath for those that aren't familiar? And I'll try to put a link up, but can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, if you could provide a link, that would be great, because that's not a program we've been linked into so much with the CMP. I think that's just something I came across as I was working on the CMP Science Committee paper. So we're more familiar with the work in CHMS and MIREC. But it also looked like, maybe there's opportunities through that that Canadian Partnerships for Tomorrow project, which also is looking at is a population health survey looking at diseases and looks. I think it would also have biosamples, so maybe biomonitoring opportunities as well. But again, it's something we're less familiar with in the CMP. Okay,
Brendan asks, has there been attempts of geographic mapping of exposures to diseases?
Not that I am familiar with, but there could be. That's something I can look into.
And the last question, if data is collected on chemicals of relevance for occupational exposure, how will risk assessment under CEPA be conducted? Would these RA look different than the current approach?
Yeah, so I think we could look at, it's still we're still early in scoping what this will look like. So what I think of mostly when I see a question like this is what others are doing internationally. And the US EPA has been publishing, their first 10 risk assessments just recently that include both consideration of general population exposures and occupational exposures in their assessment. So it's just, so it looks kind of similar to a SEPA risk assessment now. The hazard is characterized. We would normally do a general population exposure assessment. And then for, if we followed a model like the EPA, there would then also be an occupational exposure assessment included in there, and then a characterization of risk. So it's sort of like an expansion to what a current assessment looks like with those new sections.
There are quite a few comments that are embedded in questions. We do have a couple of minutes if people would like to. It's a little bit more difficult to articulate the question out of the comment.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Alec Farquhar. I was, among many other jobs, I was director of the Occupational Health and Safety Branch at Ministry of Labour. And I'm really interested if you've been thinking about how to put an integrated program on the ground. And I'll just give one example. In Ontario, we've had, I think, a really innovative program called the Asthma Plan of Action. An Asthma Plan of Action was an attempt to bring together what we'll call the general public's exposures to asthma-causing substances, their medical aspects of asthma, bringing a lot of asthma-related stakeholders to the table, and then integrating the occupational element, either the occupational causes of asthma or occupational aggravators of asthma, bringing them all into one campaign and one table. And I found that that approach sort of, there were synergies. Members of the public came to realize that if their kid had asthma, oh my God, I don't want my kid going to a workplace that might make it worse. And people getting asthma from work had an audience they never would have had before. And the combination of all of it gave it political survivability with changes of government, changes of governmental priorities and getting funding and things like that. So I just wondered, your talk's been a lot about the data gathering and the basis of all of it, but have you been doing any thinking about how it might roll out so that adding the occupational aspect strengthens the whole impact of what you're doing?
That's a great question. And it's still really early for us. I don't know, what the priority areas are or how it would roll out. But this gets me thinking to, like I was saying, there was different approaches that you could take. Like, would it be more effective to start with a sector? And I didn't say this, but or would it be more effective to start with a disease and identify the chemicals that are a primary contributor to that disease? So there are, I think, a lot of different ways you could package it, and you want to think about the way to make it the most impactful. But we're not there yet. But I would love to talk to you more about this, the asthma program, any lessons learned there, or if you have a link of something I can read more, would be great.
Just a final comment. I think there's been a lot of experience in the health promotion world with how to do this around a lot of different things. And maybe there could be some kind of a roundtable of health promotion folks where, you could bring forward the fact that workers are, I guess we'll say, the canary in the gold mine or the guinea pig or whatever for a lot of these exposures. And yet often they're very concentrated in certain workplace settings with not very many people. They never get any attention, priority. So how has the public health and health promotion world dealt with pulling together all the threads that can give greater impact around an issue? That might be quite a good engagement. I'd be glad to talk further after.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. It's Kevin here. I put a comment in the chat box. This is really for everyone else's benefit, and we've talked about this. There is a very cool model available for workplaces called the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health Essentials. So it's an online risk assessment tool designed for small to medium-sized enterprises. So anybody in Canada can actually use that, do a risk assessment, and then what it does, it actually tells you what controls you could probably use for those kind of exposures. Just to Alex's point, it does raise awareness around asthmagens in workplaces, and it does push the user to look at health surveillance for that asthmagen as well. So it's a very powerful tool, and I know we've sort of talked to about maybe Canada can learn from the experience from the health and safety executive using COSH Essentials. I just wanted to share that in front of everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin.
Just wanted to ask, the number of fatalities in Canada, we know the traumatic ones. Is there a possibility of getting an accurate workplace one? Because basically you have to go back through the provincial ones, and it's usually covered under the compensation boards.
I'm sorry, were you wondering if there is a way to get
statistics so that we know, okay, for example, if the cancer rate is going up or going down, or occupational diseases, the numbers of them over the course of the year, because basically you have to go back through the compensation boards of the provinces to get that stat. I do not believe that the Canadian government keeps those type of stats where we get a national idea of what's going on.
Trying to dig into numbers like that, and especially linking it back to chemical exposures is difficult for sure.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate we had lots of questions at you, a little bit extra than we had discussed. So I really, really appreciate your time, and Angelica. And we look forward to more updates from this effort to align some pretty jagged edges of from an exposure perspective, a surveillance perspective, from a chemical management perspective. It's important work, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much. And please do keep following the chat. And Sarah, I think we're allowed to post a PDF of your slides. So we'll be doing that with the video when we link everything together. So much appreciated, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Great. And without further ado, then, we will introduce our next speaker, who you've already heard from this morning around Asbestos-Free Canada. So Alec Farquhar is joining us now. He's a lawyer with a long career involved with asbestos disease compensation and prevention. He's currently coordinator of Asbestos-Free Canada, which he's going to speak to us about today. Previously, Alec was the director, as he mentioned, of the Office of the Worker Advisor, an agency of the Ontario Ministry of Labour, which advises and represents non-unionized workers in their workers' compensation claims and appeals. This included involvement in hundreds of asbestos disease cases. So our first session on impact in the face of occupational disease, Alec has seen that. Alec came to the OWA from Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, where he was managing director, and before that from the Ontario Ministry of Labour, where he was the director of Occupational Health and Safety Branch. In both of these positions, Alec was extensively involved in detection and prevention of asbestos disease, as well as related regulatory enforcement. Alec has extensive experience in both workers' compensation and occupational health and safety, and he has a long history of working with vulnerable worker communities, including immigrant workers, women, and young workers. He's also worked extensively on partnerships with the employer community around dispute resolution, health and safe return to work. This includes innovative joint return to work partnerships. He's fluent in Italian and French, which has helped him connect directly with the Francophone and Italian Canadian communities. He's a graduate of Princeton University, also has a law degree from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and he has served on the executive of the Ontario Bar Association Workers' Compensation Section and received the section's Ron Ellis Award for Excellence. Please welcome Alec Farquhar.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. It's so fantastic to follow Sarah. It's thrilling for me to hear the news of what's going on in her area. I represented Ontario on the Hazardous Materials Information Federal Provincial Council, and really saw the problem of the occupational aspect being sort of isolated from the environmental and sort of public health impacts. I also was on CalOSH, which is the national regulators body, and again saw the same thing there. We were in our own little silo, and having the opportunity to link up with something as big as the chemical management realm is really important. So I'm here today. Actually, there are a lot of learnings from how asbestos was addressed in Canada and around the world that might even contribute to the work that Sarah's doing and the future. I've got a lot of historical material in my presentation. I'm going to go through it really, really quickly. I'm going to try to finish in under 15 minutes. But I wanted people to have the historical stuff because sort of for the record, for a lot of you that weren't around, perhaps weren't even born when this all started. And but I will be focusing on the current situation starting around slide 13. So I'm going to go through the first several slides very quickly just to highlight what's in them. First of all, slide 1 is how big this is. Look at this, current estimates. These are from the World Health Organization and Global Burden of Disease. Are anywhere from 107,000 to 222,000 people dying annually worldwide from asbestos disease. It's an astounding statistic. And depending on what modeling you use, it's 2,000 to 4,000 Canadians. And Emil Tompa has done some fantastic modeling to show that the annual cost to the Canadian economy, just of the cancers from asbestos, is in the range of over $2 billion annually. This is an industry that was probably never worth more than a couple $100 million a year at best at its height. So I've always talked about this as a negative return on investment of a horrendous nature. We're probably at or past the peak of deaths. That's because most of these deaths are from exposures a long time ago, although unfortunately around the world, there's still a lot of people very actively exposed in areas where it's used still very actively, especially Asia. And I'll talk later about the breakthrough when the Trudeau government committed in 2016 to banning asbestos finally in Canada, and in 2018 they delivered on that commitment. So I'll do an overview, the challenges, and especially looking toward the future. This highlights how important asbestos was in Quebec and how that created the political environment that essentially meant that Canada was a laggard on the international stage for decades after other countries banned asbestos. This one is about the fact that because we were blocked by the situation in Quebec for so long, a lot of the progress was in provincial level campaigns, and a tremendous amount of progress was made just sort of chipping away at the situation. So long before a ban came through, asbestos came to be used less and less in Canada since the 1980s. And the main uses that were legal until 2018 were asbestos brake pads and asbestos cement water and drain pipes, especially in parking buildings. However, a lot of asbestos remains in place. Carex Canada is a really great organization, and they do, if you haven't been familiar with their work, check it out. They do really rigorous studies on the exposure that workers might have to carcinogens, and it's estimated that 150,000 Canadian workers are still exposed, mostly in older buildings, schools, hospitals, institutional buildings, residential settings, and very, very heavily construction workers who unfortunately have to go in and drill and cut and expose themselves. I just have a little bit here historically on the progress on the provincial and local campaigns. And you'll see a lot of progress was made, not just in the recognition of asbestos disease, but resources to support it. And of course, OCAL's played a crucial role for decades now. Here's just an example from Ontario. You could make the same kind of slide for other provinces. For 27 years now, we've had an irrebuttable presumption of work-relatedness for asbestosis and mesothelioma. So it means that hundreds and hundreds of working class families have gotten compensation from our WSIB, sometimes the same day they file a claim, as long as they can prove they were in asbestos exposure work prior to their diagnosis. And then I personally had some involvement with the implementation of the 2005 Ontario regulation, bringing in stringent controls on construction projects. And I'm really proud of that work. And there are folks on this call who played a much bigger role than I did. And I'm sure it's a tremendous career highlight for them. We have absolutely saved lives by implementing this regulation. A lot of media and public pressure started in the late 90s, especially out of Sarnia in Ontario. And that's what led to a lot of the resources that started being applied, both in our healthcare system, especially at Toronto's University Health Network, and also a lot of funding came from trade unions, from employers, the Canadian Mesothelioma Foundation. There's been a real ferment of gradual change over time in the resources and supports, both medical and we'll say more advocacy and detection and screening, especially in Ontario, but elsewhere in Canada. Look at the network of support that was put in place. This was by the Harris government in 1999. A special OCAL clinic in Sarnia, $1 million a year budget. Resources to the Office of the Worker Advisor to deal with the cases there. The Harris government even funded trade union representatives from what was then the Canadian Auto Workers and CEP to work on the cases in a community-based fashion. And it just shows you that it's not necessarily been a partisan political issue. It's been moved on by a number of different governments at different times in history. This is the growing support for a ban, and I just want to highlight, I do this often in my presentations, the courage of individual asbestos victims. Blaine Kennard in Sarnia suffered from mesothelioma, got sick and died. And like so many other patients along the way, he decided, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to take people on my journey. I'm going to show them what this does to people. And that's what he did. And when you get the slide preps on the OCAL website, take a look at Louis' photos. They show someone shrinking from 250 pounds down to, I don't even know, 80 pounds shortly before his death. And these photos were on a 2-page spread in the Toronto Globe and Mail early in the 2000s, and it was a real turning point. And Blaine's widow, Sandy, remains very active, and tragically, Blaine's brother, Harold, died of mesothelioma in 2018. These stories drew support, and here's where we really get into Sarah's story. So many of the supplies could apply to other chemicals and emerging hazards. In our case, we found politicians who'd been exposed, like Pat Martin, Chuck Strahl. Chuck Strahl got mesothelioma. Hardline conservative member of parliament. We had alliances with environmental, public health, and First Nations organizations. So there's sort of a broad public alliance that formed that lasted for decades. And part of the picture was images that were brought back from places like India, where our asbestos was used in appalling conditions. And people were ashamed. I had numerous friends who told me they were ashamed to be Canadians, that we were exporting asbestos to these places. So consensus grew. We succeeded in getting supportive editorials from the Globe and the Star in 2015. Justin Trudeau's government came to power, and the building trades played a huge role. And in 2016, at their convention, Trudeau committed to an asbestos ban. And by the way, with tremendous support from Bob Rae, played a big role in that time. Oh, in essence, and let's just think back to Sarah and then the future of this issue. Stories have been a crucial element. So we can put out data, we can put out charts, we can put out releases, but human faces are just essential. And I think OCAL has done a tremendous job putting those human faces in front of the public. International and national dimensions can be mutually supportive. So in Canada, it was white working class workers who were really primarily the victims of the first wave of exposures, although there were also Indigenous people, especially living on First Nations with asbestos in their insulation, etc. But in terms of the numbers, it was white working class workers. And yet it became an early example of environmental racism as the industry shifted its marketing to Asia. So the national and international can often help each other, and I think that could apply to lots of other exposures. Within the labor movement, which is sometimes fractured, we've united around asbestos, and unions that often are not necessarily working a lot with each other came together. That's a really important message. Can we do the same around other exposures? Employers stepped up and joined our efforts. Just take a little thought about that. A lot of activists see employers as 100% opposed to regulation and 100% opposed to action, but yet there were some who really genuinely stepped up around asbestos. A community of activists developed, and again, we could apply that to a lot of what Sarah's working on. And that meant that as people got sick with mesothelioma, they had an immediate community of support. And for the time they had on this earth, they had people to support them and work with them. And then new generations came along. And I also mentioned that public health officials, health researchers, and health professionals have played an important role. Many of us are at the grassroots level, and these health professionals and government officials, people like Sarah, they're off somewhere. They're in Ottawa. And yet they're trying to help. They're trying to connect up, and relationships with them are very important. I'll go a little bit more on relationship building, very important. I'll go a little bit deeper on that. And this applies to so many of the issues that Sarah's group and others are looking at. Relations with government regulators, with members of the health professions, with elected politicians. Some of these were relationships that we started forming 40 and more years ago. Bob Rae started his career working on injured workers cases, including the first wave of asbestos cases from the Johns Manville cement plant in Scarborough. We made it a big tent issue. I can't overemphasize this. So I'll give the example of a delegation I brought from Italy last year, from Casale Monferrato, the epicenter of asbestos exposure, a small city of 35,000 with 50 new mesotheliomas every year from their asbestos cement factory. We did not treat this as a group of activists visiting Canada, meeting other groups of activists, although that did happen. We set up some really big tent events, including a dinner and an event where we had the Italian ambassador to Canada speaking and the mayor of Toronto. And John Tory stayed for the whole thing, spoke Italian, and clearly cared about the issue. And he's the most important mayor in Canada. And we need him to step up to help us address asbestos in buildings in Toronto. Here's the asbestos ban. I won't go into detail, but a big leftover issue is the tailings in Quebec. And I'm very pleased to inform everybody that a Quebec government commission of inquiry has recommended reducing their occupational exposure level, and they're moving forward in, I think, some really positive ways in Quebec. Where does Canada go from here? we formed a coalition. Now we're calling it Asbestos Free Canada. And we've really been stalled by COVID-19, unfortunately. But we are moving towards a comprehensive strategy as they have in Australia. And our coalition is proposing an agency to lead that strategy, just like Australia has. And I visited Australia 2 years ago, and I was so impressed with the solid, sustainable nature of their strategy to get asbestos out of our built and general environment. So I'm just going very quickly through the highlights of our proposal. Registries. This relates back to a lot of what Sarah was getting at. We need solid data on an ongoing basis of where is the asbestos, how dangerous is it, when does it need to be removed, or does it need to be removed at all until the building is demolished. We need to protect workers and the public in the whole asbestos remediation process, including the occupational exposure levels and sound disposal. We need registries of the people who've been exposed and their health status. So there's sort of a linkage, especially a registry of mesothelioma victims. We need to form a mesothelioma health network and work really around the world on paying a debt that Canada has to the rest of the world. Over half the asbestos used in the world's history was produced here in Canada. Nice Canadians, or at least we'd like to think of ourselves as such, have killed, I don't even know how many tens of thousands of people with our asbestos, but it's a gigantic death toll in the most vulnerable populations on Earth, and we sure as hell owe a debt to those folks to help them deal with the mesothelioma that our product caused. We need to support the transition, especially in Quebec, and good work's being done around that. Research and innovation on safe alternatives, and finally support for a global ban on asbestos, and a big start on that is listing chrysotile under the Rotterdam Convention. So finish off with just some lessons. Big tent movement. The next phase is a little less dramatic, but potentially promising, such as integrating our efforts with infrastructure renewal. Focusing on the worst current exposure situations, for example, First Nations and other folks who are living or working in older buildings with unremediated asbestos. I'm very interested in the next presentation, which is from Anya Keefe, on the development of some standards through the CSA, and that can be an important first step eventually to a regulatory solution. Funding. I think homeowners need help, and we need programs to make this happen. It doesn't have to be really expensive. Australia has proven we can do it in a cost-effective way, but there will be funding needed. We need vigilance. We need a lot of awareness. In Australia, they've had just fantastic sort of public service ads on asbestos, and that could apply to a lot of other things. I've listed here nanoparticles, silica, polymerized sand, high-tech ceramics, new chemical hazards. I believe gradually as the exposure effects fade away, those of us involved in asbestos activism will probably merge into broader environmental and occupational health and safety struggles. And a big thank you. There are folks on this call who dedicated big chunks of their career to this issue. We won. We succeeded against all odds. We owe huge debt of gratitude to the mesothelioma patients and the families. And let's get going. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will go ahead with Anya's presentation. So Anya Keefe has degrees in chemical engineering and occupational hygiene, both from the University of British Columbia. Her initial career was with the BC Cancer Agency, where she performed retrospective exposure assessments for occupational epidemiological studies in British Columbia and internationally, including an international study of pulp and paper workers conducted by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Between 1997 and 2004, she worked at WorkSafe BC, first as a policy analyst, working on both the occupational health and safety regulation and occupational disease compensation policies, and then taking on responsibility for creating and implementing a systematic approach for research, knowledge transfer, and strategic initiatives. Since 2006, she's worked on contract for a number of organizations, including the Canadian Mesothelioma Foundation, the Occupational Cancer Research Centre, the Canadian Standards Association, Health Canada, CAREX Canada, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and the BC Cancer Agency. Since 2014, she has provided pro bono assistance to workers diagnosed with occupational diseases or their surviving spouses, helping to identify possible sources of exposure and working with them to create a comprehensive occupational history, as we spoke about in our earlier sessions, to support their claims for workers' compensation. So please welcome Anya Keith to talk about investigating the need for asbestos management standards. Anya.
So thank you for the opportunity to come and speak about a project that is still very much a work in progress. It's a project that Paul Damaris and I are doing under contract for the CSA group. And we have been working with two master's level people, Manisha Pawa, who is a PhD candidate at McMaster University, and Soham Parelkar, who is a graduate of UBC. Basically, what I'm going to do is just give you guys give everybody a heads up about the project, walk you through what we're doing, and just highlight some of the preliminary findings. A quick sense of what the purpose of the project is. It's got two purposes, and the first is that we are exploring potential gaps and best practices in asbestos management in Canada, and we're also looking at international jurisdictions as well. And the end goal of this is to determine if there's a need for the development of one or more CSA group standards. So just a kind of high-level overview about the project. It essentially involves kind of four key elements. The first is we are examining the peer-reviewed and the gray literature. And then we are also in conjunction or kind of simultaneously doing an environmental scan. So we're looking at all Canadian jurisdictions and a select number of jurisdictions internationally. And I've just highlighted the kind of four key jurisdictions that we're looking at. So Australia, United Kingdom, we're looking at European Union directives as well as specific countries within the European Union. We've been looking at mainly Scandinavian countries. And then also the United States. And we've highlighted several states that we are also kind of drilling down in a little bit more detail. So we've been looking at Washington State, California, Massachusetts, and New York State. Following those first two elements of the project, which we've just completed and we've just submitted a report to the CSA and the advisory group. We will be conducting key informant interviews, and then following that, we'll be synthesizing everything that we found through those first three steps and performing a gap analysis and then making some recommendations to the CSA about whether there is a need for one or more standards. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because Alec did a fantastic job of laying the context of kind of the work that's been done with asbestos, and then also kind of the current state that we still have situations where workers continue to be exposed to asbestos. And I'm going to guess that pretty much everyone on this call is familiar with these particular images. They are both from Carrick's Canada's website, particularly their asbestos profile and asbestos occupational exposures. And all I wanted to do here was just kind of reinforce what Alec was mentioning, that we have over 150,000 workers who are estimated to still have exposure to asbestos in Canada. The image on the left highlights the top 5 industries and occupations, and then the image on the right just illustrates the provinces in Canada where we see the kind of the most workers that are still exposed. And I'm just going to add a disclaimer. Paul and I were talking about this yesterday, and he reminded me that these numbers that are kind of reflected in these two images reflect expert-based assessments of people who are regularly exposed. And what it's not capturing are, a lot of workers where there is exposure that it goes unrecognized. So, for example, the OCRC has done work looking at school custodians, and we've also heard from insulators and other building trades unions that exposure to asbestos is much more widespread. So, I mean, this gives us a sense that there are still a lot of workers exposed, but this is likely an underestimate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through what we've done in the literature review, and then also what we've done with the environmental scan. And I'm just going to kind of give you a very high level sense of what our methods were, and then some of the preliminary findings. In the interests of time, I've had to pare things down. But if there are particular questions about some of the topics that I talk about, we can kind of drill into that in the question period. So I'm going to start out with the lit review. We focused our lit search on the topics that are kind of identified that are on the left-hand side of the slide. And Manisha and Soham searched 8 online databases. And then what you see on the right of the image is the flow diagram of, the number of records that were identified by doing the search, and then how we kind of went through and pared the articles down. So you can see, and I hope that this image is clear enough, that you can see on that top left-hand side of that right image that we identified nearly 5,700 articles. And also I should mention that we focused on the literature that's been published in the last 20 years. We restricted those articles to English, and we kind of focused on the topics on the left. Key words and search terms. There were sort of different permutations that were put together, and then it resulted in nearly 5,700 hits. In terms of the exclusion criteria, so once we went through and kind of removed duplicates, there were nearly 500 duplicates that were removed. And then we went through a screening process, and we were excluding articles if they were commentaries or letters to the editor, exposure studies without an intervention, studies that were non-occupational or not about asbestos, animal studies, clinical related studies, or clinical related reports. So if an article was just reporting on clinical guidelines or asbestos related disease screening guidelines, we excluded that. We excluded predictive or modeling studies and articles about workers' comp, and also asbestos bans. Although we did include some, there was a criterion that we also did include some, but if it was just about an article about creating an asbestos ban, we didn't include that. So after the screening criteria were applied, we ended up with about 122 articles for further assessment. And then Manisha and Soham did a full text review. And after that, we ended up with 59 articles that were included in the review. And we went through a process where we extracted data into an Excel database. When we had extracted the findings into an Excel database, we went through and we organized the findings into 6 thematic clusters. So this slide shows 3, the next slide shows 3. So the 6 clusters are asbestos abatement, exposure surveillance, waste management, evaluation of regulations, asbestos management in public buildings, and education and training. And I'm just going to quickly, kind of touch on kind of the main findings that came out of this lit review. So as you can see, we identified 4 studies that fell into the asbestos abatement category. And the main findings that came out of that, actually, let me just back up a second. Generally, what we found was that the purpose of the studies that fell into that cluster was to evaluate the performance and effectiveness of control measures that are used to protect workers from exposure during asbestos abatement. And what we found from those studies was that some of them were identifying that the measured levels of exposure were elevated relative to the exposure limits. and that the recommendations that came out of those studies kind of generally pointed to that there's a need for better procedures and or better ways of protecting workers, and also recommendations around the need for a proactive exposure surveillance system. In terms of exposure surveillance studies, we identified 10 studies that fell into this cluster. And again, it was kind of reiterating some of what we found in the first cluster, which is that there are some workers in some industries that may still be exposed at levels higher than the exposure limit. And then they, kind of concluded that certain types of data systems, data collection systems, are useful for, they have different uses that are useful for evaluating the impact of regulatory milestones like bans or lowering of exposure limits. Also that they can help identify hotspots in terms of exposure or disease for intervention. The only other thing I'll comment on in relation to this cluster is that there were studies that were pointing to the usefulness of national exposure registries, and also that these worker registries and or exposure registries are useful, but that they should be based on established principles of effective occupational surveillance. And it's a little out of scope for me to talk about what those are. But if anyone has any questions, either I or Paul can answer that question. In the waste management cluster, we identified 11 studies, and mainly what we found with the studies in this cluster were that they were more experimental, and they were looking at different methods for treating the waste that contains asbestos after an abatement project. And so they were kind of looking at different ways to process the asbestos-containing waste so that it wasn't just asbestos being dumped in a landfill. Generally, the conclusion was that there are innovative methods out there, but that there are still some pretty large barriers to widespread adoption and implementation in the jurisdictions that they were looking at. One of the other observations that came out of the studies in this cluster was that two of the things that are required for implementing a dedicated national asbestos strategy is multi-level government support. So not only federal, but provincial, and then at the municipal level as well. And also stakeholder engagement is also absolutely necessary. So moving on, we identified 6 studies that kind of fell into this cluster of regulation evaluation. Generally the main findings were that, bans are effective, but, you can't evaluate the effectiveness of a ban within, a very short period of time. So, we've implemented a ban here in Canada in 2018. We're likely looking at decades to see, in terms of disease surveillance, to evaluate the effectiveness of that ban. There was a modeling study that we included where they modeled the number of mesotheliomas under different scenarios, where they kind of looked at different OELs and then looked at kind of the proportion of employers in compliance. And what they found in that particular study was that even with the most health protective exposure limits, we're still looking at a relatively high number of mesotheliomas being forecasted out through the next 50 years or 40 years. And then one of the other key recommendations or kind of observations that came out of this cluster was that you sort of need, in terms of asbestos management, there is a need for a very holistic approach. So not just taking a regulatory approach or a surveillance approach, but kind of an approach that incorporates all elements. So regulation, training, monitoring, surveillance, and also better diagnosis, which kind of ties into some of what Alec was saying in terms of, kind of the moving forward, what needs to be done. In terms of the cluster looking at managing asbestos in public buildings, we identified 2 studies. One that was based on the proceedings of a workshop where they were looking at kind of research needs and evidence gaps. And the key gaps that were identified in that particular project were sort of this question that still remains to be resolved around, do you remove asbestos or do you manage it in place? Also, that there needs to be more research done on the effectiveness of controls during removal and clearance, and then also techniques to measure airborne levels at lower levels than are currently feasible. And then we also encountered several, some articles here, but also in some of the other clusters that outline best practices for removal. And one of the studies in this cluster recommended that an asbestos registry and also better training and competency of workers is absolutely key. And then finally, the final cluster was looking at education and training. And the general conclusion is that training appears to have a positive impact on asbestos management, but that there still is the potential for disparities in knowledge between different occupations, and so that this is kind of an important intervention and an area to focus on. Moving on, I'm going to walk you through what we found in the environmental scan. And again, in the interest of time, what I'm going to focus on is what we found from looking at the Canadian context. We also looked at these areas across those international jurisdictions. And if anyone has any particular questions, I can kind of pull up the report on my computer and then answer them. But I'm not going to go into that any detail of that today. Basically, we looked at the Canadian context, and so that is 14 jurisdictions. We looked at all provinces, the federal government, as well as the territories. And these are sort of the key areas that the scan focused on. So we looked at the kind of legislative and regulatory context for asbestos management, looked at definitions. And when we get to that slide, I'll kind of give you a sense of how many definitions we identified. But what I'm going to focus on today, I'm going to kind of share with you the kind of what we see across the country in terms of the definitions of key terms like asbestos, asbestos-containing materials, and friability, as well as competency. I'm going to briefly highlight what we found in terms of the requirements for identifying the hazard and risk assessment. Touch on what we saw in terms of requirements for prevention and protective measures, and the kinds of things we're talking about there are prohibitions on asbestos use and activities, control measures. We also looked at containment and disposal, but I'm not going to go into any detail about that today. Talk a bit about what we learned about competency and training requirements. Briefly highlight what we also learned about the requirements for documentation. And specifically what we looked at were asbestos inventories and record retention. I'm going to highlight what we learned about asbestos inventories. And then finally, monitoring and measurement. I have several slides where I talk about kind of what's being done across the country, or what's being required across the country in terms of exposure monitoring, exposure limits. I've got a couple of slides that compare the exposure limits, and then I'm going to end by talking about health monitoring. Starting out, looking at kind of the legislative and regulatory framework in Canada for managing asbestos. What we found was that it is addressed by legislation and regulations in three principal areas. So occupational health and safety, environmental protection, public health. But there are some other areas of legislation at the federal and at the territorial level where asbestos, or kind of managing asbestos, is mentioned. So in terms of the rest of this presentation, I'm really going to be focusing on, what we learned from looking at the occupational health and safety regulatory framework. So what we found, and this probably shouldn't come as a surprise, but every jurisdiction in Canada has something in their regulations that kind of make specific mention of protecting workers and protecting workers from exposure to asbestos. There was every jurisdiction, so all 13 of the 14 jurisdictions have some kind of area within their regulations that specifically addresses asbestos. There is one that doesn't, but it actually is found within their mining regulations. So we have the 13 that address, sort of have mention of asbestos within their OSH regulations. 4 jurisdictions in Canada have additional regulations beyond their general OSH framework. 9 have either industry-specific or substance-specific regulations, and of those, 7 of them apply to mining, and 4 have regulations that apply specifically to construction. What we found in terms of the environmental protection regulatory framework was that 9 jurisdictions in Canada have some kind of requirements, either within their Environmental Protection Act or their subordinate regulations that address asbestos and asbestos management. And 2 jurisdictions have some kind of requirement within their Public Health Act that addresses asbestos. Going to start out by just touching on what we learned about the terms that are defined. We did download, we went through all of the regulations and the acts, and we actually Soham did all of this, kind of all the drilling down into all of the regulations and legislation for us. And so we have a spreadsheet where we've downloaded 93 terms that are defined within the various frameworks across the country. Not every jurisdiction defines the same terms. So what I'm going to focus on are these 4 terms today. I'm going to focus on these 4 terms that are used to refer to asbestos. So we've got asbestos, asbestos-containing material, asbestos dust, and then also friable or friability. In nearly all jurisdictions in Canada, these terms, and as you can see, the one that's most commonly defined is asbestos-containing material. But there are some pretty notable differences in, in some jurisdictions, they're defining them in regulations. In others, they're defining them in codes of practice. And in others, they're defining them in guidelines. So, and then we're also seeing some differences in terms of the exact language of the definition. So there's some variability across the country in how these terms are defined. What we found was that 9 jurisdictions in Canada have a definition for asbestos that includes these, the fibrous forms and it sort of specifically relates to the fibrous form. 3 jurisdictions in Canada have no definition of asbestos, but they have a definition of asbestos-containing material. 2 in Canada define asbestos as an asbestos-containing material, but it's kind of a circular definition because they then describe an asbestos-containing material to mean something that is a manufactured article or other material that contains 1% or more asbestos by weight, but they actually don't really say what they mean by asbestos. In terms of asbestos-containing material, what we found was that 13 of the 14 jurisdictions define it, but the exact language differs across the country. Generally, it states that it includes materials which could be manufactured articles, products, building materials that contain some minimum percentage of asbestos. And what you see in brackets here is that minimum percentage varies. So in some jurisdictions, it's 0.1%. And that it's in 2 jurisdictions in Canada, actually it's 0.1%. In 4 jurisdictions, it's 0.5%, and in 8 jurisdictions, it's 1%. We that actually adds up to more than 13. And the reason for that is that there are 2 jurisdictions that have 2 definitions of asbestos containing material. And that's their definition includes a threshold based on whether it's friable or non-friable. 5 jurisdictions in Canada include vermiculite as a sort of a separate category of asbestos containing material. The definition of asbestos containing material in some jurisdictions define it as being based on dry weight. We've got 1 jurisdiction that bases it on volume, and then 6 jurisdictions in Canada also incorporate some reference to the analytical method that's used. And I've got a little bit more information on a different slide about the different analytical methods that actually are explicitly referenced in the regulations. In terms of asbestos dust, we've got 5 jurisdictions that talk or define the term asbestos dust, and it is defined on the basis of asbestos particles or fibers being airborne or being likely to become airborne after settling out in the work environment. 13 jurisdictions in Canada define friable or friability as a standalone term or in relation to asbestos containing material. And so I've just pulled out examples of the key words that are used to define it. 10 of the 13 jurisdictions use this quote of crumbled, pulverized, or powdered. The other 3 use some combination of those words, but not necessarily all 3. They're not consistent about which 2 words they're using either. And then 12 of the 13 jurisdictions include the qualifier of when dry and by hand pressure as part of their definition. Moving on to the requirements for identifying the hazard and also assessing the risk. We found that there are 6 jurisdictions in Canada that have explicit requirements for identifying the hazard. Others, it's implicit, but you sort of have to kind of tease that out a bit. But in some, they are very explicit about the requirement to identify the hazard, and they also outline some of the factors that that they would require, or elements that would be kind of required or recommended as part of identifying the hazard. So the kinds of things that were identified are things like reviewing the site history, reviewing architectural plans, walkthrough survey. Walkthrough survey is the most commonly referenced element. Collecting representative samples, determining whether the samples are asbestos containing, and some are also requiring that it be done by a competent person. Where we've got recommendations around testing requirements as part of the hazard identification, and as you can see, there are 12 jurisdictions that require that. What we saw was that there's not consistency in terms of the method that is recommended. So we have 4 jurisdictions that are recommending EPA, 8 that are recommending NIOSH. There is a little bit of overlap in some of those jurisdictions where they're saying, either or. 1 recommends the IRSST, and then we have, I think there was about 3 that were saying an appropriate method or an approved method, but they weren't kind of relating it to either NIOSH or EPA or the IRSST. All jurisdictions, or almost all jurisdictions, require that an asbestos inventory be performed, and that those records be kept. So you see we've got 11 jurisdictions where we identified explicit requirements for an asbestos inventory, but the elements that are required vary. So 10 of the 11 are explicit that that the inventory needs to document the location. 7 that it has to document the type of asbestos. The state of the material or the friability is explicitly mentioned in 5 jurisdictions, that it must be kept current, and then 3 of the jurisdictions require that the inventory or kind of the asbestos that's identified needs to be inspected annually. 10 jurisdictions had requirements that were explicit around risk assessment, and all of those were, required that the location, the type of asbestos-containing material, and condition be included. 9 of those 10 had some, like they actually within their risk assessment requirements made explicit reference to activities that they had categorized as low, moderate, or high risk. In terms of the prevention and protective measures, as I mentioned, I'm just going to quickly touch on prohibitions and the hierarchy of controls. You can see that 12 of 14 jurisdictions have some mention of prohibition. 8 are focused around, or they prohibit the use of crucidolite, and 8 are explicit about spraying of asbestos. All jurisdictions have some kind of, it's in some cases it's very explicit that they're talking about the hierarchy of controls. In other cases, it's more implicit. It's like, that you need to control exposure, but they don't explicitly link it into, kind of moving from most protective to least protective. And you can see here that some, but not all, are explicit about elimination and substitution. The most frequently identified control is kind of falling in that engineering controls, where 13 of the 14 require HEPA filter vacuum cleaners, equipped vacuum cleaners. And administrative controls, and the most common one is, and it's in all jurisdictions, is wet methods. And then differing types of procedures that are identified in terms of, preventing spread or protecting surfaces or repairing asbestos-containing materials. All jurisdictions have some kind of provisions around personal protective equipment. All of them require respiratory protection. Some, but not all, prescribe the type of respiratory equipment that they require. And then, but there's some sort of differences in terms of kind of what's being worn and the types of filters, if they actually are prescribing it. And then almost all, except for the federal government, have language about protective clothing. So just to quickly touch on competency and training, what we found was that 9 jurisdictions define the terms in that first bullet point. So they are, but they're not defining all of them. So some are competent, some are qualified, competent worker, qualified worker, that kind of thing. The one thing that we did find was that although they are, they might use different terms, it's all kind of based on some combination of knowledge, skills, and training to perform an assigned or required duty or task. 11 jurisdictions have some provisions around adequate training or a need to complete an approved course or receive training appropriate to the risk. They're not consistent in terms of the whether they include requirements around, or whether prescriptive requirements around the topics to be covered. There are 10 of the 11 jurisdictions require that the training cover hazards, the selection and use of PPE, correct operation of required controls. Only 7 are requiring that they know how, or they're trained on how to identify asbestos-containing materials. So in terms of exposure monitoring, even though most all jurisdictions have an exposure limit for asbestos, not all of them are explicit about the requirement to take personal samples. 9 jurisdictions explicitly require that personal monitoring be performed. All jurisdictions have requirements around the need for area sampling, although what the specific activity or operation that triggers the need for area sampling varies. And so I've just listed here in that first bullet point the types of activities that would trigger a need for area sampling. The frequency in some jurisdictions is specified. More often than not, it's once per shift, but we also see words like intermittently or as necessary. And then some jurisdictions are specifying the location. 11 of the 14 jurisdictions we looked at have requirements for clearance sampling. And then I've just listed here that the level, sort of give you a sense that the kind of the levels that are specified vary considerably across the country. So we've got, in some cases, they're saying that it's safe at 0.01 fibers per cc, and then it ranges all the way up to 0.2. This basically shows you that there are 8 jurisdictions with the same, like they've all adopted 0.1 fibers per cc. I wanted to just highlight Quebec, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon as having kind of substance specific or levels. So, and then if you go to the next slide, very short, they have 2 jurisdictions with a 15-minute exposure limit. And then the last slide was just on 8 jurisdictions have requirements for health monitoring programs and differences in terms of the specific tests that are required.
So the first one from Lawrence, he asked, any idea how much illegal asbestos crosses into Canada from flight shipments?
I can't answer that question.
I could speak to that possibly. I didn't hear the last part of the question though. It's illegal asbestos into Canada from what?
From shipments.
Okay. This is a really big issue, and I'm even wondering if it needs regulatory attention. One thing is what the official regulatory approach is in any given country. Another thing entirely is in the complex world of global trade, what's floating around. And absolutely, I was astounded by the scale of some of the illegal, absolutely forbidden uses of imported products. They had a massive shipment of, it was rail cars, thousands of them from China. And of course, they weren't supposed to have any asbestos in them, but they had lots of asbestos in them. When I was on the committee, we discovered some astounding stories. One was a type of carbon fiber that was treated as such in the occupational setting. I think these are like massive washers, but to call it a washer is not really correct. They're just huge manufactured products that were used, I think, in generation or something like that. And they turned out to be 100% asbestos. And then, of course, brake pads for a long time. Now asbestos brakes are illegal, but you never know what's out there in the aftermarket and how things might play out. So you really need very effective monitoring. This is especially at the federal level. When products come into the country with some kind of random testing and a real sort of high level of vigilance, because there are unfortunately unscrupulous manufacturers. Primarily, I don't think they're in Canada or anything like that, but we import a lot from other places. So it is a real area of concern.
Question from Dorothy for Anya. Have you talked to Bob Sass and others in Saskatchewan about what they've been calling for with building registers, etc.?
No, not yet. Although, thank you, Dorothy. I just made a note of Bob's name so that we can follow up with him as part of our key informant interviews, which is the next step. We did download all of the regulatory requirements or anything that's in the Act and in regulations related to the building registry. So we have captured that information. I just didn't have capacity to present that today.
See, one last question here. Kevin asks, why is there so much disparity between jurisdictions around asbestos management? And that's for Alec.
As well, I'll just to make my observations based on experience and a little bit of international work and research. In In Canada, a lot has developed provincially, and it has really varied a lot. So, for example, just the mesothelioma irrebuttable presumption, it's almost unique in the world. It's not necessarily in other provinces whatsoever. So it often reflects moments in the struggle around asbestos around the world that have hit different jurisdictions in different ways. So that's the general explanation. And also, there have been some jurisdictions where the asbestos industry has remained powerful one place long after it had lost its influence in another place. So that's the overall explanation.
Thank you. There are quite a few bits of commentary. If you'd like, John, you can unmute. And I did want to let people know, John has quite respectfully agreed to come back next week or the week after. We did want to ensure we included COVID content due to this unprecedented time for occupational illness that we're in. And he's agreed to transfer that small demo of the regional risk tool to one of the upcoming weeks. So stay tuned for that. And there was commentary. Anya's work is hopefully going to inform a CSA standard that she presented today for the Unifor comment. And please do go ahead and unmute your line if you have additional questions. There again is a lot of commentary versus questions for us. So please feel free to unmute your line with a question or to expand.
This is John. Just to add, I just put in a link into the chat box to an article that we were part of, and Paul Demers was also co-author too, where we looked at a job exposure matrix for asbestos miners in Bay Verte. It's not directly associated with any of the topics we're talking about, but it's some of the work that OCAL has been involved in, and that has recently been published. It's available free online.
I just wanted to add a little bit of background to the fact that CSA is developing or at least looking at developing standards in the area of asbestos management. Sometimes when CSA develops a standard, there's an uphill fight getting the issue recognized afterwards on any kind of other level. So for example, health and safety. We still don't have very substantial measures across Canada dealing in a regulatory fashion with chronic stress. It's an uphill fight. We're making gradual progress. I want people to know that around asbestos, I believe there's a lot more support for the development of these standards and then potentially for regulatory action that might follow up. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into, but I sit on the Strategic Steering Committee for the CSA's health and safety programs. The national regulators also sit on that committee, and there was essentially unanimous support from everybody, employers, labor, and regulators, to develop this initially the research report, and I think there'll be a lot of support to develop the standards afterwards. So we've got a real head of steam around asbestos management, and the work Anya's done, I think you've seen the quality, is going to potentially have a lot of impact in the coming years.
If I can follow up with Alec on that, one of my concerns about the CSA process, especially when we saw it with the noise control standard, is that they took the existing legislation across Canada as kind of their cue for their recommendations. And I'm really worried that if they look across Canada, are they going to go to the lowest standard across Canada? Or are they even going to look internationally to recommend an even lower standard for occupational exposure and for clearance criteria? Because if it's just a consensus standard about what's existing in Canada, it won't protect workers sufficiently.
Maybe I could comment, and then Anya, is that all right?
Yeah, sure, that would be great.
So just my comment from the point of view of someone who's sat on the, I've been on the CSA Strategic Steering Committee twice now, the 2000s and now more recently. I was a regulator before, and I guess now I'm sort of a labor-oriented member. And I think John's comments is really important, but there's sort of a flip side. Often standards are useful to get your foot in the door. And sometimes years later, they're adopted or maybe improved upon in a regulatory setting. So that's one of the arguments for working in the standards development area. And John's right, because they're consensus-based, there's often sort of pressure to be satisfied with the low action and harmonize down, I guess you could say. But I believe on asbestos that for the smaller jurisdictions and the ones that don't have a whole lot of measures in place, there'll also be a sort of harmonization up. And I believe that a lot of the folks with regulatory involvements or career involvements in asbestos management really want to move this thing along. Having said that, Asbestos Free Canada is there to push people, and I can tell you right now, there's a lot of interest in Asbestos Free Canada in the European measures around occupational exposure levels, which are 10 times lower, for example, in Ontario. That's just one example. So it's a mixed bag, and advocacy and pressure from a lot of the same people that were part of the ban asbestos struggle will continue to be really important.
And if I could just add to that, what I was focusing on today was what was happening in Canada, but we actually have, we are capturing information from jurisdictions around around the world. So as I said, we're looking at Australia, we're looking at some of the jurisdictions in the US, the European Union, and particularly to your point, John, that you had in the chat comments, we are looking at the Nordic countries, we are looking at the Netherlands, we are capturing the exposure limits that are recommended as well as those that have been adopted and are implemented and are being enforced. So that information will inform our recommendations. We won't just be focusing on the Canadian context.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you to all of our speakers today. Sarah from Health Canada on the Chemicals Management Plan, Alec and Anya, and thank you to John for offering. It's just really important for us to mark the time that we're in and the biggest occupational illness we're experiencing. So we'll move that, but we have placed a link to the regional risk tool, and our theme is to harness the energy of this acute occupational illness to our efforts in our more chronic or long latency disease prevention that we've talked about today. So it's a mixed bag for sure. There's been a lot of great commentary. Please take a look. We are linking, providing links to various tools and of course our evaluations, which we hold near and dear and make improvements. Today we had a lot more interaction in the session. So please join us next week and the week after. Thank you again to our speakers and contributors and all of your commentary and questions. So I really, really appreciate your attending. And we're going to sign off for the day. We will be posting the videos along with PDFs of the presentation. And thank you, Nancy. Yes, she's also presented some links. Yes, the earlier ODAP presentations are also of benefit. So please do take a look for our past and future sessions. Thank you, Bonnie. We're also including a link there. So they are archived for future use at various committees or sharing to crowds that couldn't make it today. Many, many thanks. Signing off. Stay well and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you, Kimberly, and everybody. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Anya. Thanks, Sarah. Have a good day, everyone.